Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomaly Archive where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you're listening to my videos from since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'd heard of trauma before, read about it in books, but there's something different about living through it. Isaac's family had been killed when he was 4. His parents, his brother and sister, all slaughtered in their beds, throats cut wide open, blood splattered everywhere. The police said the walls were so soaked in red, they couldn't see the wood anymore. They threw up when they saw the scene, all of them. Isaac had been hiding in a closet, curled up, shaking with his hands over his ears. He couldn't speak for months after it, wouldn't even look anyone in the eye. He was broken then, and he stayed that way. The people who raised him, his aunt and uncle, tried to pick up the pieces, tried to make him whole again. I met Isaac years later, in med school. We were both tired, both overstressed, both trying to keep our heads above water in a sea of endless exams and assignments. We ran into each other at the library. He had been reading a thick textbook, and when I bumped into him, we dropped our books everywhere. We both said sorry at the same time. I thought he was cute, though he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was messy, his eyes bloodshot, and I was surprised when he offered to buy me coffee as an apology. I accepted, and it turned into dinner, and that dinner turned into a life together. We moved into an apartment off campus. We spent a year together before Isaac finally told me about his family, about how they died. He didn't want pity. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to forget. He didn't want anyone to look at him and see that broken little boy from the crime scene photos. And I didn't pity him. I loved him, and that was all that mattered to me. But he didn't talk about it often, and when he did, I listened. But I never pushed. Things were good for us. Too good, I sometimes thought. Isaac was different from what I expected. He was funny, calm, intelligent, everything I could have asked for in someone. But that past of his, it was always there, hanging in the back of his mind, like a dark cloud threatening rain. Then came the 20th anniversary of the murders. That's when things started to change. The reporters found us almost as soon as we stepped outside. They were everywhere, at the university, outside our building, waiting at the corner of the street. Isaac shut himself off. He didn't speak to them. He didn't want to. It was hard for him. I knew that. I suggested we go to Oakley, his aunt and uncle's town in Virginia. They lived in a rural place. No reporters, no media, just some peace. We packed up early, snuck out before anyone could catch wind of us leaving. I thought it would help Isaac. I thought he needed a break from the madness. I didn't know I was wrong. The drive to Oakley was long, 8 hours, but it was easy. We laughed at old movies, talked about school. The sun was barely up when we left, so we stopped at a McDonald's to get breakfast. Isaac wasn't himself, but I thought that was just the stress of the anniversary. We got there late in the morning. His Aunt May and Uncle Fred greeted us. They were kind, warm, but I could see the same sadness in their eyes when they looked at Isaac. They'd never stopped looking after him, but something had changed. They could feel it too. Isaac was different now. The house in Oakley was an old Victorian. It looked dark and imposing, especially with the fog surrounding it. I didn't like the look of it. It had high arches and a strange tower at the top that seemed to touch the sky. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it as soon as I laid eyes on it. Isaac turned to me as I looked up at the house. His smile was there again, but it wasn't the usual smile. It was stretched, too wide, like it didn't belong on his face. His eyes were wide, too, like he wasn't quite there. I didn't know what to make of it. "Isaac," I asked, my voice too soft. He blinked at me, his expression faltering for a second before it returned to normal. "I'm fine, Cass," he said, his voice distant. But I wasn't convinced. Aunt May came out of the house, her blue cardigan fluttering in the wind. She gave us both a hug and ushered us inside. She was warm, kind, and she talked about how nice it was to have us there, how it had been too long since Isaac had visited. Uncle Fred was quieter, sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper, glancing up occasionally to smile at us. That night, Isaac was quieter than usual. He didn't talk much. He went up to his room and started reading a comic he found there, like he always did when he was stressed. I stayed downstairs with Aunt May and Fred. We had a nice meal. The atmosphere was calming. I thought Isaac would be okay here, that the peace would help him settle. I didn't expect what happened next. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, trying to shake off the tension I felt in my chest when I looked in the mirror. Isaac was standing behind me, but it wasn't the Isaac I knew. His smile was there again, stretching across his face, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was too close. I jumped and spun around, smacking him on the shoulder, furious. "Isaac, what the hell?" He didn't react. His smile didn't fade. He didn't say anything. I was beyond angry now. This wasn't funny anymore. "Stop it," I said. "Stop it," with a creepy smile. He blinked at me, confused. "What smile?" he asked. The whole situation made no sense. I left the bathroom, ignoring him. This was just stress, I told myself. Maybe it was the anniversary getting to him. Maybe he was just messing with me. But deep down, something told me it was more than that. We went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. I woke up later that night. The door creaked open, and there was Isaac, wearing a white t-shirt, walking out of the room. It was pitch dark. I checked the clock. 3:30 in the morning. What was he doing? I whispered his name, but he didn't answer. His footsteps were quiet as he moved down the stairs. I threw on my slippers, grabbed my robe, and hurried after him, trying to keep my breathing steady. Isaac was already outside, walking across the yard. "Isaac," I called out. My voice was shaky, but I forced it louder. "Where are you going?" He didn't look back. His feet shuffled slowly, as if he didn't even hear me. It was like he was sleepwalking, moving without purpose, his posture stiff, his body jerking with every step. I ran faster now, trying to catch up with him. He reached the forest line. I stopped just short of it. He turned to face me. That smile, the same wide, grotesque smile, was stretched across his face. My blood ran cold. "Isaac," I screamed. "What is happening? Why are you doing this?" He didn't say a word. He just stood there, grinning at me like something out of a nightmare. Then he turned around and disappeared into the trees. I couldn't just let him go. I could hear the faint sound of his humming, just like before, soft and eerie, filling the cold night air. "Isaac," I called, desperate to get him to turn back. I had to stop him. This wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the figure in front of me kept moving, the humming growing louder, more haunting. It was him, but it wasn't. Then ahead of me I saw him, but something was terribly wrong. His head was turned backward. His body was facing away from me, but his head was twisted all the way around. That same terrible grin stretched across his face, and he pointed upward. I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the damp ground. My eyes couldn't look away. The trees above were no longer empty. Isaac's aunt and uncle, May and Fred, were hanging from the branches, their feet limp, their bodies swollen and bruised. But it was their faces that made me scream. The same grotesque grin was stretched across their faces. Before I could move, Isaac, or whatever it was, let out a high-pitched laugh that sounded like nothing human. It echoed through the trees, rattling my bones, sending me into a frenzy. I turned and ran. I had to get away. I couldn't stay here. I wasn't going to die in this place. I didn't make it far. My foot caught on something, some root, I think, and I fell face first into the dirt. My vision blurred, my head spinning, and I felt the cold ground against my cheek. That's when everything went black. I woke up in the same bed. It wasn't the forest, but it felt like I hadn't left. My head pounded. I reached up to touch the back of it, where the sharp pain was. My fingers came away wet. Blood, but there was no wound. I didn't understand. I tried to sit up, but the world spun. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands to my temples, willing the dizziness away. I was back at the house. I was safe, I thought. Aunt May was sitting next to me. She had a warm smile, the kind that was meant to reassure me, but it didn't. She said I'd fallen down the stairs. I didn't remember that. I didn't remember anything after I fell in the woods. "You're all right, dear," Aunt May said, patting my hand. "Just a bump. You'll be fine. Isaac found you." Isaac. The thought of him made the hairs on my neck stand up. What happened? What had I seen in the woods? I forced myself to sit up again, ignoring the dizzying ache in my skull. My body felt sluggish, heavy. I looked at Aunt May. She seemed so calm. Too calm. "Where is Isaac?" I asked. She smiled again, though it didn't reach her eyes. "He's downstairs, dear. He was so worried about you." I nodded, but the unease didn't fade. The way she said it, too perfect, too scripted, it wasn't right. I couldn't place it, but I felt it in my bones. Aunt May left to get me some tea, but I didn't move from the bed. I stayed there, staring at the walls, waiting for the dizziness to pass. I could still hear Isaac's laugh echoing in my head, that shrill, high-pitched sound from the woods. The image of his body, twisted in unnatural ways, stayed with me. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay, but I didn't know where to go. I finally dragged myself out of bed, pushing the blankets away with shaky hands. My feet hit the cold floor. I took a step forward. The floor creaked under my weight. I steadied myself against the nightstand. I had to find Isaac. I had to know what was going on. I walked down the hallway, but when I got to the stairs, I froze. Isaac was standing at the bottom, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on me. His smile was still there, stretching across his face like it had never left. He didn't blink. His body didn't move. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the first move. "Isaac?" I asked, my voice low, uncertain. He didn't answer. He just stood there grinning. It wasn't the Isaac I knew. It couldn't be. "Isaac, please," I said, stepping down the stairs slowly, each movement hesitant. "What's happening?" He didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear me. His smile remained, wide and unsettling, like it was glued to his face. I was getting closer now, closer to the source of the fear that had been gnawing at me. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and Isaac moved toward me. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground. His movements were too smooth, too controlled, like a puppet being manipulated. He stopped just a few feet away. I could see the details now. The sharpness of his teeth, the way his lips stretched unnaturally. His eyes were too wide. They were hollow, empty. The smile that stretched across his face was no longer human. "Isaac," I whispered again, my voice trembling. The grin widened even further, if that was possible. His mouth seemed to stretch, the skin at the corners tearing slightly. His teeth were jagged, too many of them, sharp like knives. The smile had become grotesque, not just unnatural but repulsive. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "What happened to you?" Isaac's eyes never wavered. He didn't speak. His smile grew. I felt like I was suffocating, like I was being crushed under the weight of his presence. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs were frozen. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with inhuman speed. It was cold, too cold. His skin was smooth, unnaturally so, and it felt like ice against my flesh. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. I could feel the bones in his fingers, sharp and stiff, pressing into my skin. I tried to yank my arm back, but it was useless. He wasn't letting go. "Let go of me," I cried out, but Isaac didn't flinch. His eyes were still locked onto mine, unblinking, his smile still plastered across his face. I struggled harder, but his grip tightened even more. The coldness of his touch was spreading through my arm, up to my shoulder, numbing everything in its path. I was beginning to lose strength. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't break free. Then, just as suddenly as he had grabbed me, Isaac let go. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out from under me, and I fell to the floor. I scrambled to get back up, my palms scraping against the wooden floor, but Isaac didn't move. He was still standing there, watching me, his smile still as wide as ever. My body was shaking, my limbs weak and unsteady. I looked up at Isaac, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing to make sense of. The man I had loved was gone. He had been replaced by something unrecognizable, something that was neither human nor animal. Isaac, I mumbled again, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. Please, what's happening to you? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His presence, his grin, told me everything I needed to know. Then I heard the sound of the footsteps, as though they were coming from the other end of the house. I turned to see Aunt May standing in the doorway, her face pale and tired. She had seen it too. She had seen what Isaac had become. Lena, Aunt May said softly, her voice strained. You need to leave. Now. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, suffocating me, paralyzing me with fear. But Aunt May was already moving toward me, her hands trembling as she reached for me. Go. You can't stay here. You're not safe. She said it like she already knew. Like she already knew what had happened to Isaac. And she wasn't going to stop me from leaving. She was trying to save me. I got up slowly, my body still trembling. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I felt a chill on the back of my neck. And I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't make it out of this house alive. I don't know how long I stood there. The sound of Aunt May's voice, soft, urgent, was muffled. I couldn't feel my legs, my arms. I was frozen. I looked at Isaac, then at Aunt May. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. She wasn't looking at Isaac anymore. She was looking at me. The weight of her gaze was worse than Isaac's smile. Lena, she muttered again, her voice barely a sound. You need to get out of here. It's not safe. I didn't move. I couldn't. I didn't know where to go, where to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But the sight of Isaac, the way he stood there, unmoving, like a statue, sent a chill straight into my bones. His body didn't seem right. His eyes didn't blink. He was still smiling, that same grotesque smile, that smile that never seemed to fade, no matter what happened. It was like it had become part of him. It wasn't just his face. It was his whole being, twisted into something that was more than human. Aunt May moved toward me, her hands shaking as she grabbed my arm. Please, she said, her voice low. You have to listen to me. He's not who you think he is anymore. He hasn't been for a long time. I tried to pull away, but her grip was tight. She wasn't going to let go. I looked back at Isaac. His face was the same, twisted, horrifying, but something had changed in the air between us. Something I couldn't understand. Isaac's smile widened. Aunt May pulled me toward the door, her breath shallow. She was trembling. I was trembling. We reached the front door. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. My hands were shaking so badly, I couldn't even get a grip on the knob. I told you, Aunt May whispered. It's not safe here. Isaac's footsteps sounded behind us. Slow, purposeful. His feet never seemed to make a sound. He moved toward us, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and face him again. I could feel him getting closer. Hear his breath, shallow and cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Isaac, I said, more to myself than to anyone. I had to speak, had to say something, but nothing made sense. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Aunt May's hand gripped mine, pulling me back from the door. "No," she said. "Don't look. Don't turn around. We have to get out now." I didn't understand. None of this made sense. It was Isaac, but it wasn't. It was a thing pretending to be him. But why? Why wasn't anyone stopping it? I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see the thing that had once been my boyfriend, my Isaac. But I had to. My body moved on its own, against my will. Slowly, I turned around, and there he was. Isaac stood there, his head tilted to one side. His neck cracked loudly, the sound of bones grinding against each other. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was grinning, gaping wide, like he was going to swallow the world. His lips split as the grin stretched impossibly farther, revealing teeth so sharp they seemed to glow in the dim light. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring through me. "Isaac," I said, but it wasn't him. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't anything human. The thing in Isaac's body took a step forward, and I could feel the floorboards creak beneath its weight. I backed up, stumbling over the rug in the hallway, but Aunt May held me steady, her grip like iron around my wrist. "It's too late," she said softly, her voice breaking. I tried. I couldn't stop it. I didn't understand. I couldn't make sense of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But where would I go? The house was too big, too silent. The air was thick with the smell of rot, of decay. Isaac, or whatever it was, moved closer. His footsteps were soft, but I could feel them. Feel him getting closer, the air growing heavier, colder. Aunt May pulled me toward the stairs. "We have to go upstairs. We can't stay here. We can't hide in here." I couldn't move. I was frozen again. Isaac's form lurched forward, moving in a way that was too quick, too jerky. His body twisted. His arms bent at impossible angles, his joints cracking as he reached out for me. His hands, no, his claws, were long, sharp, his fingers curling into grotesque shapes, the nails jagged, black as night. The thing that had once been Isaac reached for me, but Aunt May shoved me forward. "Run," she said, her voice steady now. "Go." I didn't ask any more questions. I ran. My feet stumbled, slipping on the old wooden stairs, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the top of the stairs and turned to find Aunt May standing behind me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just fear, something I couldn't name. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed the door handle to one of the bedrooms and flung it open. She shoved me inside. "Stay here," she said. "Don't leave this room." The door slammed behind me. I pressed my back against the wall. I didn't know what was going to happen next. All I knew was that Isaac, or whatever had become of him, was downstairs. And I couldn't escape. There was no way out. The house was closed off. The windows were sealed shut. The only way out was through Isaac's twisted hands. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor. My head spun. My hands were still shaking. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The whole house felt wrong. It felt like it was closing in on me. I listened for a sound, anything that might give me a clue about what was going on. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silence. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, scratching. Soft. Almost gentle. It came from the corner of the room, where the closet door stood half open. It was the same sound I'd heard in the woods before, when Isaac had walked into the forest with that smile on his face. It was a scraping sound, slow. I looked at the closet. I knew what it was, but I didn't want to believe it. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't care. I had to know. I couldn't sit there any longer, waiting for whatever was coming. I walked over to the closet. The sound was louder now, louder and closer. The door creaked as I pulled it open. Inside, at first, there was nothing. Then I saw it. Isaac's body, his true body, slumped in the corner. His clothes were torn. His face was covered in blood. his mouth still twisted into that grotesque grin. But this wasn't just Isaac. This was something else. This was what had happened to him. This was what had replaced him. The thing in the closet raised its head slowly, its hollow eyes opening wide. And it smiled. I stood frozen in front of the closet, staring at Isaac, or what had become of him. The thing that had once been the man I loved was now a twisted mockery of life, barely recognizable. His body was mangled, his skin stretched too tight over bones that looked like they were cracking under the pressure. His eyes were wide, too wide, empty and black. But the smile was still there. The same grotesque, impossibly wide grin that stretched across his face like a mask he couldn't take off. He raised his hand, but it wasn't Isaac's hand anymore. It was too stiff, too angular. The fingers were long and clawed, the nails yellow and cracked. His hand moved toward me, slowly, as if he was savoring the moment. I turned away. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. The door to the room was still locked, and Isaac, or whatever was left of him, was between me and the only exit. I looked back at the closet. The thing was still smiling. It was too quiet, too still, and then it started to move, slowly at first, dragging its body across the floor with jerky, unnatural motions, its claws scraping against the wood like an animal on the prowl. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it get closer. I had to escape. I reached for the window, but it was locked. The glass was thick and cold beneath my fingertips. I pulled at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was getting closer. I had no choice. I turned away from the window and ran toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, and I heard the thing behind me, its heavy breathing growing louder with each passing second. The door opened. I was out, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. The sound of claws scraping against the wood. The slow, steady beat of footsteps following me. I turned a corner and stumbled into the living room. The air felt heavier here, colder, like it was filled with something that shouldn't be there. I stopped for a moment, gasping for air, but then I heard it again. The scraping, the soft padding of feet behind me. It was getting closer. I looked around the room, searching for something, anything that could help me, but there was nothing. The walls were too close, the space too small. I had nowhere to hide, no way out. I heard the thing in the hallway now, moving slowly, almost leisurely, like it was enjoying the chase. My hands were shaking, my thoughts racing. I had to get out. I had to leave. But how? And then I saw it, the door to the kitchen. I ran toward it, but as I reached for the handle, I felt the air shift behind me. The thing was right there. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew. The smile, the sound of breath, the heavy, sickening feeling in my stomach. I flung the door open, desperate. I ran into the kitchen, my feet skidding on the floor. The back door. It was there. I rushed toward it, slamming into it with my shoulder, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked. I slammed my fists against the door. It wouldn't open. The thing was getting closer. I had no choice. I turned back, my body shaking, and saw it in the doorway. Isaac, or whatever was left of him, was standing there, his grin still stretched wide across his face, his eyes hollow and unblinking. He took a step forward, in another. His fingers were twitching, clawing at the air. He was getting closer. I didn't have time. I didn't have time to think. I ran. I had to get out. I couldn't stop. The thing was still behind me, still following me, its breath growing louder, closer. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me as I ran. The floor creaked under my feet, the silence pressing against me like a weight. I reached the staircase, the door at the top. I ran up the stairs, my hands grasping the railing for balance. But the thing behind me was getting closer. I felt it. I heard it. The sound of feet dragging against the floor. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I reached the top of the stairs. The door at the end of the hall. I ran toward it, slamming into it with my shoulder. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the room. The door slammed shut behind me. My head was spinning. I turned to look around the room, but it was empty. There was nothing. No way out. I fell to my knees, my body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. The thing was right behind me. It was coming. It was going to get me. I could hear its breath, heavy and ragged, getting closer. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I stood up again, my thoughts blurry. I couldn't think. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw something. The closet. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, throwing the door open. Inside, I saw the body. Isaac. His body. His broken body. His bloodied skin. But it wasn't just his body. It was his face. His face was twisted in a grin, a smile. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I couldn't move. The thing that had been Isaac was standing behind me, and it smiled. I didn't want to go, but Nolan insisted. That's how it always went. He was persuasive in a way that made you think you were making your own choices. I should have known better. I was used to the noise of the city, the chaos, the strangers. Moving to Brooklyn had been a relief, but it was all different than I thought. People here didn't make friends. They made connections, transactions. Nolan was one of those guys. Good-looking, confident, a financial guy who wore his privilege like a second skin. He said I'd enjoy it. I was still trying to figure out what it meant. He told me it would be fun, that it was a tradition of his and his friends. Game night, he called it. I asked if it was like Dungeons and Dragons. He laughed, said it wasn't, but he didn't say what it was instead. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. Mitch's place was where they always gathered. It was in a building that looked like it was meant to be torn down. The hallway smelled of mildew and old carpet. The door opened, and the heat of the apartment hit me. There was a stale air to it, like something hadn't been aired out in years. I should have left then, but I didn't. Nolan was at my side, his hand on my back like he was pushing me in. Mitch greeted us with an exaggerated grin. "You're here," he said, like the place was his kingdom. He extended his hand. "Nice to finally meet you. Kevin's been talking about you." "Angie," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, too firm, and I didn't like the way his fingers lingered a moment too long. I smiled back, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel warm, just the right amount of friendly. Nothing more. The other guys were lounging on the couch, Miles and Harvey, their eyes following me as I walked in. Jason, the one with the camera, was already snapping a picture. It felt too fast. The night hadn't even started, but it already felt like I was the center of something I didn't understand. "Can I get you a drink?" Mitch asked, heading toward the kitchen. I nodded. "Wine's fine." I wasn't picky, never was. The truth was, I had no idea what I was walking into. "Let's get the game set up," Nolan said, pulling me toward the back. "You'll love it. Just wait. It's different. It's something you'll remember." I didn't know if I liked the sound of that. There was a second room in the back. A door stood closed. I tried not to look at it, but the room felt off. The air was heavier, colder. I should have asked Nolan what was behind that door, but I didn't. Nolan took me by the hand and led me to the table, the others following, sitting down in a circle. "Cheers," Mitch said. The glass in my hand felt too cold, too heavy. The wine wasn't good. It wasn't bad either. Just there. I drank it, trying to swallow the discomfort creeping up my throat. Jason came up with his Polaroid, grinning wide. "You two look great together. Let's get a picture." I didn't know if I wanted to smile. It felt forced. Nolan put his arm around me, too tight. The camera flashed. I hated the sound it made. The whir of the film, the way it slowed down the moment, stretched it out. The others smiled at the photo developing, waiting to see what it would look like. like it was all some game, some sick joke. When the photo was handed to me, I could see it. I could see the way Nolan looked at me. The smile wasn't real. Neither was his touch. The room started to feel smaller, the air thicker, the walls pressed in on me, squeezing the life out of the space. Mitch and Jason exchanged glances. "We're just waiting for the rest of the setup," Nolan said, his voice cold now, not warm anymore. It had lost its charm. The more he spoke, the more I started to feel nauseous. The room was spinning. It wasn't the wine. It wasn't the drinks. It was them. It was this place. "Do you know Jason and Mackie?" Mitch asked. "Mitch has been telling us about you." It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement. They were measuring me, like they had already made up their minds about me. I nodded, but my head felt heavy. "Yeah, I know them." Jason laughed, but it didn't sound like a real laugh. It sounded hollow. "You'll love it," he said, and something about the way he said it felt wrong. Once we get the game started, I didn't like the sound of that. The air was thick with tension. I felt like I was the only one who didn't understand. The others were too quiet. Their eyes flickered from one to the next. Even Nolan wasn't smiling anymore. I tried to focus on his face, but it was hard. My head was spinning too much. "Mackie should be here soon," Mitch added. He didn't seem nervous. He seemed eager. "Then it's game time." I didn't know if I could play their game. I didn't even know what their game was. Then the door to the second room opened. I wasn't prepared for what came through the door. It was Jonathan, but it wasn't Jonathan. The man in the door had the same familiar face, the same dirty blonde hair, but his eyes were different. His expression was wrong. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't anything like the brother I knew. "Mackie's here," Nolan said, like everything was fine, like this was part of it. This wasn't just an old nickname. It was a mask, and I knew then what he was really hiding. "Jonathan," I said. The words came out before I could stop them. "What are you doing here?" His eyes met mine, and his face drained of color. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at Nolan, then back at me. "This is your sister?" Jason asked, stepping in. His voice was teasing light, but I heard the venom underneath it. Mackie didn't answer. His eyes were on the ground, and his hands trembled. I didn't know if it was from fear or something worse. He turned quickly, backing away from me and Nolan. The room was closing in on me. Their faces, Jason's, Mitch's, Harvey's, were too much. They were too close. Nolan looked at me. He looked at Jonathan. "We didn't think you'd show up tonight, but now we've got the full crew." Something in his eyes told me it was too late. I had walked into a nightmare, and no matter how much I wanted to leave, they wouldn't let me. Jonathan's eyes flickered to me again, but he didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. His face was pale, like a man who had already lost. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," Jonathan mumbled, backing away into the darkness of the back room. I could feel the weight of it all as I sat there in Mitch's apartment, the others staring at me. They were seeing something else. Nolan stood in front of me, his expression colder than it had been all night. I didn't know what had shifted. All I knew was that the smile on his face was gone, replaced by something darker, something calculating. Jason had gone quiet too. His camera was still hanging around his neck, but now it felt like a tool, not just an accessory. "Why didn't you tell me you had a sister?" Nolan asked, his voice still calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The words didn't feel real. My brother, Mackie, Jonathan, was standing in the back room, avoiding my gaze, his hands shaking. I wasn't sure if he was afraid of me or afraid of them, but either way, it didn't matter. His presence in the room was a trigger. I could feel the shift in the air. Nolan's eyes narrowed. "You didn't think it was important to mention that?" He took a slow step toward me, closing the gap between us. I opened my mouth again, but my voice didn't come. Instead, I felt a surge of nausea. The smell in the apartment was getting worse. It wasn't just the wine or the old carpet. "What's going on?" I asked, but the words felt thin. What do you all want with me? Jason stepped forward, his grin stretching wide again. It's not about what we want, Angie. It's about what you're going to give us. His voice sounded hollow, and I flinched. The way he said it, it was like a promise, but not a good one. The sound of the camera clicking in the distance made my skin crawl. It was a reminder that I was being observed, measured, studied. I don't want to play, I said, my voice strained. Oh, you will, Nolan replied, his hand tightening on my arm. He didn't look at me when he spoke. His gaze was fixed somewhere in the room, distant, but the pressure of his grip was sharp. You'll play. You don't have a choice. I pulled my arm back, but it was useless. I could feel the pulse in my fingertips, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick, choking, and it felt like there was no escape. The walls pressed in from all sides, and every breath I took felt like it could be my last. I'm not doing this, I whispered, but the words didn't sound strong. They didn't even feel like mine. Oh, but you are, Jason said, his voice turning almost soothing, like he was trying to calm me down. We've been waiting for this. I didn't understand what he meant. The others had said nothing. They were still watching, still waiting. I could see the hunger in their eyes, and I knew that whatever game they had in mind, I was already part of it. I had been from the moment I stepped into Mitch's apartment. Jonathan's voice came from the back room, quiet but sharp. Stop it, Nolan. This isn't what we agreed on. Nolan didn't respond. He turned to face the others, and for a second, the group seemed to settle into a stillness, as if they were all part of a ritual I didn't understand. The door to the second room creaked open. Jonathan stepped into the light, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He didn't look like my brother anymore. He looked like one of them. His expression was tight, his mouth set in a grim line. He wasn't afraid of what was happening in the room. Not really. He was afraid of something I couldn't yet see. Why didn't you tell me about her? Jonathan asked, his voice quieter than it had been before. He wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to Nolan. Because it wasn't relevant, Nolan said. She's here now. That's all that matters. Jonathan didn't respond. He only glanced at me, his eyes flickering with something, guilt maybe, or fear. You don't have to do anything, Jason said, his voice almost too gentle. You just have to be. Kevin stood up from the couch, moving closer to me, his presence imposing. This is for your own good, Angie, he said, his voice low and soothing. You'll understand soon enough. I felt the weight of his words sink into my chest. Understand what? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The words didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Why was I here? Why was I being treated like this? They weren't friends. They weren't even people. They were monsters, and I had walked into their den, and now there was no escape. I don't want to play, I said again, but this time my voice was trembling. I could feel the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to let them see me break. Not until I knew what was really going on. Oh, you will, Nolan said again, his voice cutting through the air. And you'll be good at it. You're going to give us everything we want. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just wanted out. But the door felt like it was miles away, and no matter how hard I tried to move, my body wouldn't obey. The door to the second room creaked again. Jonathan stood at the doorway, his back turned to me. You don't get it, do you, Angie? He said, his voice barely audible. You're not here by accident. You're part of it now. There's no turning back. His words hit me like a slap. I turned to Nolan, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at Jonathan, his jaw clenched, his face hard. The tension between them was palpable, and I could feel it in my bones. They were playing their own game, one I didn't understand, and I was caught in the middle of it. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The room seemed to spin again. The walls were closing in, and then the light flickered once more. I heard the music again, distant, eerie. It was like a warning, a signal. And I knew, in that moment, that I was trapped. I was part of their game now. I tried to move but couldn't. It was as if my limbs weren't mine anymore. I could feel them, heavy, aching, but they didn't obey. I could hear the others moving around me, their footsteps soft but deliberate, their whispers filled with anticipation. Nolan stepped forward, closer than I had realized. His smile was gone, replaced by a blankness that made my skin crawl. His hand reached for mine, but I pulled away before he could touch me. I couldn't let him. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd seen. "You can't keep running, Angie," Nolan said, his voice low, almost soothing. "You're part of it now." I didn't want to be part of it. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want them. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled under me. I felt my hands touch the cold floor, my skin burning against the rough carpet. I could hear the others, too close now, their eyes fixed on me, watching, waiting. I couldn't remember when the fear started, but it was overwhelming now. It was too much to ignore. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't just the wine, or the sweat, or the sourness of the room. It was something deeper, something that clung to the walls, suffocating everything in its path. The smell of death. I could feel it on my skin. "I don't want this," I mumbled, but my voice cracked. "You don't get to choose anymore," Jason said. I could hear footsteps behind me now, the floorboards creaking under the weight of whoever was coming closer. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see who it was, but I had to. I had to know if they were here for me, if they had come to finish what they'd started. Jonathan's face appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes empty. "Don't," he said. "Please don't." The world felt like it was closing in, suffocating me. It was like I was drowning in my own fear. "We're past the point of no return, Angie," Nolan said. "We're here. You're here. It's all the same now." I couldn't make sense of his words. I didn't want to. They didn't matter. None of this mattered. I just wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I could feel my body, aching, unwilling to obey. "We're playing the game," Mitch said, stepping into the light. His smile was gone, replaced by something darker, something hungry. "And you're the prize." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't part of their game. I was just here. I didn't ask for this, but they were here, standing around me, waiting. "Get up," Nolan said, his voice steady, but I could hear the edge in it now. "It's time." I didn't have a choice. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling. The room was spinning again, but I managed to stay upright. I could feel the men's eyes on me, weighing me, measuring me. I was nothing to them. I was just a body, a plaything, a part of their twisted little game. "Move," Nolan ordered, his tone sharper now. "It's not over." I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream, to claw my way out of this nightmare, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The fear was too much. The weight of it was too heavy. I felt like I was drowning in it. The room was too small now. The walls were too close. The men were too close. I couldn't breathe. Jason stepped forward, his camera still around his neck, the flash of it catching the light. "We're just getting started," he said. I didn't want to hear him. I didn't want to hear any of them. But their voices were in my head now. Their eyes were on me, and there was nothing I could do. They were closing in, tightening the noose, and I couldn't get away. I wasn't allowed to. Nolan's grip secured around my wrist, and I felt the pressure in my chest increase. He was dragging me back toward the center of the room, toward the table, toward whatever this was. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to focus on something, anything, just to block out the dread that was building. But the moment I tried to look away, the sound of the door creaking open again broke my concentration. The others stood, their movements silent. They were too close now. I couldn't breathe. "Time to play, Angie," Mitch said, his voice low. "This is where it ends." I shook my head, trying to pull away from Nolan, but his grip didn't loosen. It only tightened. Please, I gasped, my voice breaking. I don't want this. You don't get to decide, Nolan said again, his voice devoid of warmth. You're in this now? I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But I knew what they wanted. They wanted to break me. They wanted to tear me apart. And they were going to do it. They were going to do it slowly, piece by piece. We're not finished yet, Nolan said, and I could hear the coldness in his words, the finality. You don't get to leave. The world tilted again. My head felt like it was going to explode. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, but Nolan didn't let go. He kept pulling me forward, dragging me closer to the center of the room, and then, just like that, I was there. I was in the center, trapped, surrounded. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. But it was too late. I was already part of it, and there was no way out. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, pulling me deeper into the haze. The weight of it all, of them, pinned me to the floor. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I only felt the suffocating grip of their eyes on me. The weight of their presence too much to ignore. They were still standing around me, unmoving, watching, waiting. The room was too small, too cold, and no matter how hard I tried to focus, it all felt blurry, disjointed, like I was slipping in and out of reality. I could hear them. I could feel them, but it didn't matter. It didn't make sense. Nolan's grip on my arm didn't loosen. It was a vice, cold and unyielding. He was pulling me up now, forcing me to my feet, and I let him. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't do anything. I wasn't strong enough. I was too weak. The wine, no, the drugs had done this. They had already taken control, and I was just along for the ride. My head spun. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every breath I took. Get up, Nolan said again, his voice low, firm. This is it, Angie. You've made your choice. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt numb, like the words wouldn't form. I couldn't understand him. I couldn't understand any of it. I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake from, a game I hadn't agreed to play. But here I was stuck in the middle of it. There was no turning back. I knew that now. I was still dizzy, but I let Nolan pull me. I had no choice. I wasn't in control anymore. My body moved, but it didn't feel like mine. My feet shuffled across the cold floor, the room spinning, the sound of my breath harsh and uneven. It was too much. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to stretch, bend in impossible ways. The light from the lamp overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that crawled across the walls, stretching toward me, toward all of us. Nolan pushed me toward the couch where the others sat. They hadn't moved. They were still watching me. Mitch's voice cut through the fog in my head, thick and calm. We've all been through this, Angie. It's your turn now. It's time. Time for what? I didn't know. I couldn't answer. I couldn't form the words. It was like my mouth was full of sand, like my body was too heavy to lift, too weak to move. The others just sat there, staring. It felt like they were all waiting for me to do something I couldn't understand. I'm not playing, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But they heard me. They always did. Oh, you are, Jason said, his voice light, almost playful. You're already in it. You can't back out now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body wouldn't obey. They had already won. I was already part of it. There was no escape. I tried to look away from them. I tried to focus on something, anything, to block out the sight of their faces, their cold, calculating expressions. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop looking at them. It was like I was locked in place, frozen in time, caught in their trap. You're not the first, Mitch said. His voice was so casual, so calm, it made my skin crawl. You won't be the last. This is just how it goes. We've all played. We've all been through it. Get up, Angie, Nolan said, his voice harder now, a command. It's time to finish this. My legs shook beneath me, but I pushed myself up. I had no choice. My body moved, but it wasn't mine to control anymore. It was them. They were controlling me. I could feel it in the way they touched me, the way they pulled me into their orbit. It was like I was being dragged through the motions, unable to stop, unable to breathe. Nolan moved closer, his hands cold against my skin. I could feel his breath on my neck, hot and suffocating. His voice was a whisper in my ear. "You're going to give us everything. Everything we want. You're going to be good for us. Don't fight it," Nolan said. "It's easier this way." I wasn't sure what was happening anymore. The room was spinning again. The world was spinning, and I couldn't keep up. It felt like I was being torn apart, like something inside me was breaking, shattering, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to break free, but I couldn't. I was already too deep. I was already part of it. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were pressing in from all sides. The light above flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows. I could feel their eyes on me, the men watching, waiting. They were all part of this. They were all complicit. It felt like I was drowning. It felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. Their hands, their eyes, their voices. They were everywhere, pressing in from all sides. There was no way out. There was no escape. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it, the faint outline of the door. It was barely visible, but it was there. And for the first time since I'd entered this apartment, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to move. I had to get to that door. I had to escape. The weight of their eyes on me was too much, too heavy. But I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I took a step, then another. The men weren't moving. They were still watching me, but I didn't care. I didn't have time to care. I reached for the door. My hand was shaking, but I reached. I grabbed the handle, and I yanked it open. The world outside was dark. The air was cold, but it didn't matter. I had made it. I had found the door, and I had escaped. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. I remember the first time I saw Clayton, standing at the edge of a birthday party, pulling rabbits from hats and making doves disappear. It was supposed to be a simple show for kids who had sugar in their veins and no patience for anything but instant gratification. But Clayton made them laugh, and that was all I needed to see. He had a way about him. Funny, kind, self-effacing, with just enough of a twinkle in his eye to make you think he knew some secret you didn't. When he walked over breathless, face painted, asking for a cheeseburger, I thought he looked adorable. Beneath the makeup and the rainbow wig, he looked like someone I could trust, someone I could love. We got married 3 years later. The wedding was small, a park, a rented Mini Cooper packed with his clown friends, the whole lot of them squeezing into one car like some kind of joke. I laughed, and that was the thing about Clayton. He was always making things funny, even when the world didn't seem like it could be. For a while it worked, but after the first year, when the bills started to pile up, when the mortgage didn't get paid on time, when the calls stopped coming from Mr. Giggles, the clown began to change. The laugh that had filled the air with joy started to sound forced. He started to get quieter, disappearing into the spare room, leaving me to carry the weight. The spare room. It used to be a place where he kept his costumes, his juggling pins, his balloon animals. But slowly, the room became a tomb for whatever was left of the man I married. And I wasn't sure how to pull him back out. It started with the late nights, the muffled conversations behind that door, quiet and urgent. I told myself it was nothing, just Clayton talking to himself. Everyone has their little rituals, their ways of working through the things they don't say. But it happened too often, every night, and it gnawed at me. The sounds were strange. His voice was too soft, too distant. I tried to ignore it, just as I tried to ignore the way he stopped looking at me the way he used to. But the silence, The increasing distance. It piled up, pressing in until I couldn't breathe. I had to know what was going on behind that door. One afternoon I knocked. He didn't answer at first, and when he did, it was slow, as if he was trying to hide something. He opened the door just a crack, and I could see the room behind him, filled with clutter, old costumes, pieces of broken props, empty boxes. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. My voice felt thin, like it might break apart. "Just an old friend," he said, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for something to hide. I didn't believe him. He shifted, the muscles in his neck twitching. "Just a colleague." I crossed my arms, pushing my face into his. "Which one?" His eyes went distant, his voice lowering. "Dan, you don't know him. He moved to Australia years ago." The lie hit me like a slap. I swallowed it, but I could taste it, bitter and sharp on my tongue. I had heard about her, the woman he used to perform with, the one he never talked about. But I didn't press him. Not then. I turned away, the door clicking shut behind me. The gnawing was still there, but I pushed it down. I couldn't deal with it right then. A few months later, I took a new job at Blue Chicago. It wasn't the first time I'd worked in a restaurant, but this place was different. I was the head chef now, my name on the menu, and the money was better than it had ever been. Suddenly, I wasn't just scraping by. I could buy the things I'd always wanted. I could afford things that made me feel safe. But Clayton wasn't the man I had married. His eyes didn't meet mine anymore. His hands shook when he took a drink. He never touched the expensive knives I bought for the kitchen, even though they were the best money could buy. I remember the day I pulled one from the display. The Zweiling. Shiny. Perfect. I held it up to the light. Clayton's eyes tracked the blade like it was a snake. His voice came soft. "How much did it cost?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Don't worry. We can afford it." But he didn't smile back. He never smiled anymore. He was always like this lately, snapping, second-guessing, pacing the house when I wasn't there. The arguments were building. I could feel them. I could feel everything crumbling beneath the weight of what was unsaid. "Maybe if you took that Amazon delivery job," I said, my voice low, trying to cut through the tension. Clayton snapped back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, you want me to quit clowning? Is that it?" He didn't look at me when he said it. His voice was rough, but there was something else behind it. The desperation was creeping in. I didn't want him to quit. I never said that. But I was tired of pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. I wanted him to see me, to see us, the way he used to. I wanted us to laugh like we did before, when we first met. But instead, it felt like he was slipping away. A few days later, Clayton started to leave the house even more often. He would get last-minute calls, odd times, odd places, nothing that ever made sense. I didn't ask him about them anymore. I couldn't bear to hear the lies. But when he came home late one night, I could hear him muttering to himself, something about getting better. The word stuck with me. I hadn't planned to go through his things. It was a slip, really. I just wanted to see what he'd been doing, what had been eating at him. His phone was on the kitchen counter. I picked it up. The passcode was our anniversary. His messages were there. Just work stuff, nothing personal. I felt like I was intruding on his life, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced at the photo albums while I waited for him to return. My fingers traced the edges of pictures, but the weight in my chest didn't ease. That's when I saw it. A picture of Clayton from his first show. He was younger then, bright-eyed, with the same wide smile I'd fallen in love with. And beside him was the hand puppet, the one he'd talked about years ago. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. The puppet, Bon Bon, had always been a part of his act. But now, seeing it again, something felt wrong. It wasn't the puppet itself. It was the way Clayton had looked in the picture. He was laughing, but his eyes were distant, lost. He wasn't really there. That night, when he came home late from the children's hospital gig, I had an idea. I'd make him dinner. Something special. The tenderloin, his favorite. I lit candles and set the table. I'd make him smile again. I had to. But when he stepped through the door, I could see it, the weariness in his eyes, the same look he'd worn for days. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice flat. "I thought we could have a romantic meal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I made your favorite." His response was muted, but he nodded and went to change. The candles flickered, the meat grew cold, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. When he returned, he didn't look at me the way he used to. There was nothing in his eyes. He wasn't there. I was used to the silence. In the restaurant, I could deal with it. In the kitchen, surrounded by knives and the heat, the quiet was welcome. But at home, it wasn't the same. I'd grown used to the laughter, the noise of Clayton coming and going, the hum of his clown shows, the kids laughing. But when he stopped coming home, when he started staying in that room, I could feel it. The silence in our house became too loud, too oppressive. At first, I tried to ignore it. I worked, I focused. I put my energy into everything I could control. The dinners, the recipes, the shifts, everything but Clayton. I knew he was struggling. I knew the gigs weren't coming in as much, but I thought that was just life. Things would pick up. They always did. I didn't expect him to change like this. I didn't expect him to disappear. Then it started, the late night conversations. At first, it was nothing more than a murmur behind the door. Muffled voices, too quiet for me to make out, but loud enough to make me wonder. I passed it off. He'd always been a bit odd, a bit eccentric. He'd joke about his imaginary friends sometimes, but that wasn't it. I started to hear words. His voice too sharp, too insistent. I don't know when I started to listen, but once I did, I couldn't stop. The room always quiet when I passed by. I would knock, but the door never opened. I'd call his name, but he wouldn't answer. It was like he was already gone. I don't know how long it went on, but it was long enough to start eating away at me. I couldn't sit still anymore. I couldn't focus on work. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. I had to know. I knocked again. But this time, when I pushed the door open, I was ready. Ready for anything but what I saw. What I felt. Clayton was sitting on the floor, his head tilted to the side. His face was painted, but not like before. His smile was stretched too far. The edges of his lips split, cracked, like his skin had been pulled too tight. His eyes were open, but not really. Not the way they used to be. He didn't look at me when I entered. He didn't even seem to see me. Clayton didn't speak at first. He just sat there, staring ahead, fingers twitching on the floor in front of him. I don't know how long it took, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, he lifted his head, and the smile stretched further. His lips cracked again, but he didn't wince. He just smiled, a smile so wide it looked unnatural. I could see the red streaks in the corners of his mouth where the skin had split. "Clayton?" I said, my voice hoarse, unsure. "Who are you talking to?" He blinked slowly, then looked at me, but his eyes weren't his anymore. They were blank, empty, hollow. I couldn't see the man I'd married behind them. "I'm busy," he said, his voice rough, too quiet, like a whisper that shouldn't exist. "Who's in here with you? Who are you talking to?" His hand twitched, reaching for something beside him. A puppet, Bonbon, the one he used to perform with. It was resting in his lap, its face staring up at me. I hadn't seen it in years, but there it was. Its tiny, stitched smile was crooked. The eyes were empty, but it wasn't the puppet that scared me. It was Clayton. He was holding it so gently, as if it was alive. He ran his fingers over its head, smoothing the fabric. "It's just Bonbon," he said, his voice breaking in a way I couldn't understand. "Clayton," I said, stepping forward. "What is this?" He smiled wider, his eyes never leaving the puppet. "Nothing, just a bit of work. You wouldn't understand. I wanted to turn away, to leave, but something kept me there. I couldn't leave him like this. Not when I still had a shred of hope that he could come back. But he didn't. Clayton didn't come back. The next few days were more of the same. I came home from work, and he was always in that room, always sitting in the corner with Bonbon in his lap, murmuring things to it. I didn't understand the words. I couldn't. It wasn't human. It wasn't right. But I didn't know what else to do. I kept telling myself it would get better, that maybe this was a phase, that maybe he would snap out of it. But he didn't. One night, after a long shift at the restaurant, I came home and found the house strangely quiet. I hadn't heard him when I came in. I hadn't heard anything. The silence was like a blanket, thick and heavy, pressing down on everything. I walked through the hall, toward the spare room, and as I passed by the door, I heard it. A scraping noise. Slow, like nails dragging across something hard. I stopped, pushing the door open, just a crack. I should have turned back. I should have, but I didn't. Clayton was sitting in his chair. Bonbon was on the floor beside him, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Clayton's fingers twitched as he moved them across the floor. He was dragging something behind him. At first I couldn't see it, but when I stepped closer, I saw the blood. Thick, dark. It was leaking from the corner of the room, pooling across the floor. The stench hit me immediately. Clayton's eyes locked onto mine as he slowly, methodically, dragged a piece of broken glass across the floor. The scraping sound was the worst part. "You're hurting yourself," I said, my voice shaking. "What are you doing, Clayton?" He didn't respond. He just continued dragging the glass. His eyes were fixed on me, but they didn't see me. I stepped forward, and that was when I saw the cuts on his hands. The skin was torn, the flesh raw, the blood dripping from the tips of his fingers, pooling on the floor. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't finished. The blood was everywhere, streaking across the walls, the floor, staining his clothes. He didn't even seem to notice. I turned to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. But as I reached for the door, I heard his voice. "I'm fixing it," Clayton said softly. "I'm fixing it all." I didn't look back. I didn't say anything. I just left. The night started to blur. I'd go to work, come home, and the house would be just as quiet. The spare room was always locked. I couldn't ask anymore. I had stopped knocking. I had stopped talking to him. He didn't look at me anymore. He didn't respond. It was like I was invisible. The thing in that room, the thing that used to be Clayton, wasn't him anymore. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see him in it. I don't know when I stopped looking for him, but I did. The puppet Bonbon had taken his place. The voice was never his. The way he moved wasn't his. It was all wrong, but I kept hoping that if I stayed long enough, he'd come back. I kept hoping. I started to hear voices again, but not in the way I expected. At first they were soft, just murmurs, but then they grew louder, more insistent. It was like Clayton was arguing with someone, but the words didn't make sense. I couldn't understand them, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. I couldn't tell if he was talking to me, or if it was someone else. And then I'd hear the laughter. High-pitched. It wasn't his laugh. It wasn't even close. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like it was crawling through the air. One night, after a long shift, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I opened the door. Just a crack. I didn't want to, but I had to. The air inside was thick, like something had been suffocating in there for days. The light was dim, and for a second, I thought maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I didn't want to see what was in there. But I stepped in. Clayton was sitting in the corner. Bonbon was in his lap. The puppet's eyes were fixed on me. It was sitting up straight, its head cocked to the side. It wasn't normal. I knew it wasn't normal, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop myself. Clayton's face was different. His smile was too wide. His lips cracked, the skin torn at the corners, like it was pulled too tight. The paint on his face was thick, but it was streaked with something darker. His hands trembled, fingers running along the puppet's face, smoothing the fabric. I couldn't stand it. I turned and left, but the door slammed behind me. It wasn't the wind. I knew that. I could feel his eyes on my back. The skin on my neck prickled, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him like that. The next day, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself it was the stress of everything, the job, the bills, the house. It wasn't just Clayton. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The scraping, the laughter. It was there, always there. It filled the house, followed me into work. That night, when I came home, I went to the kitchen. The knives were laid out on the counter, gleaming under the light. I don't know why I picked one up, but I did. I held it in my hand, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't like it would do anything. I felt the blade's edge against my skin, felt the coldness of it. It was an anchor, a reminder of who I was before. I was still standing there, staring at the knife when I heard it. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I froze. It was closer now. I could hear it in the hallway, scraping, dragging. I felt the air shift like something was in the room with me. I dropped the knife, but I couldn't move. The scraping grew louder, coming from just beyond the door. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was coming. But I had to. I had to. I opened the door slowly. Clayton was on the floor, his body writhing, twitching in a way that didn't seem human. The puppet was beside him, its small face staring up at him. He was muttering to it, his hands trembling, his fingers twitching like he was trying to pull something out of the air. He didn't see me. He didn't hear me. It was like he was lost, trapped in something I couldn't understand. I stepped forward. "Clayton," I said, my voice rough. "Stop. Please stop." He didn't respond. He didn't even look up. The scraping continued. It wasn't coming from Clayton anymore. It was coming from behind him. The floor was moving. The walls were creaking. I could feel the house shifting around me. The scraping grew louder. And then, suddenly, the floor cracked. A small section of the wood splintered open, revealing a black, thick liquid beneath it, oozing up like it was alive. It crawled across the floor, pulling itself forward, spreading like a stain, like something that didn't belong in this world. I turned away. I couldn't look anymore. The next morning, the house was silent again. I thought I had dreamed it, but when I walked into the kitchen, I saw it. The floor was still wet, still stained with the dark, viscous liquid. It had spread further, staining the tiles, creeping across the room. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to stop it. The next time I went into the room, Clayton was still there, still muttering to the puppet, still lost. I couldn't fix him. I couldn't fix any of it. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every part of it felt wrong. Clayton wasn't Clayton anymore. I had stopped recognizing him weeks ago, but I kept telling myself it would change, that things would get better, that he would come back. He never did. He couldn't. The night it all ended started like every other. The scraping noise, the sounds coming from the room, the endless murmur of voices, Bonbon's hollow stare. I had to face it. I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. My body froze in place. The terror that had been eating at me for days, for weeks, had finally caught up. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the door, knowing what was behind it. But I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I heard his voice, low and unrecognizable, whispering from the room. It wasn't his voice. Not anymore. It was Bonbon's voice. I could hear it in the words, in the way he spoke. It was mocking, cruel, like something that had taken him over and left nothing behind. His body wasn't even his anymore. It was a puppet's body. He was no more human than the thing he had created. I stepped into the room. Clayton was on the floor. Bonbon was with him, the puppet's face staring up at me. But it wasn't just a puppet. It was an extension of him, an extension of his madness. It had grown larger, its head too big, its mouth too wide, its eyes too knowing. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was flesh. Flesh made of the same twisted thing that had taken over the house. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull Clayton away from it. to take him in my arms and shake him awake. But there was nothing left of him. His eyes, glazed over, didn't recognize me. His hands, trembling, were gripping the puppet's limbs like it was the only thing left in the world. I stepped forward. I felt the weight of the air in the room pressing down on me. It wasn't just the silence. Everything was alive in that room, and none of it wanted me there. I heard the sound of scraping again, but this time it was coming from the floor. The wood was shifting beneath my feet, groaning as though it were trying to hold something back. I didn't move. I couldn't. The floor cracked, and the dark liquid started to seep through the cracks. It spread across the floor, crawling toward me like it had a mind of its own. The liquid started to rise, curling up my ankles, its temperature wrong. Too cold, too slick. I could feel it slipping between my toes, spreading across my skin like it was trying to pull me in. I looked at Clayton again. His hands, stiff and unblinking, were still clutching Bonbon. But now the puppet was moving, jerking, like it had a life of its own. Its mouth opened. It was speaking to me. It wasn't Clayton's voice anymore. "You've been too long in this house," the puppet whispered. "Too long pretending you can save him." I stepped back. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to face it. But I couldn't leave. I turned away. I couldn't save him. I had tried. I had tried everything, but it was too late. Clayton was gone. Mr. Giggles had taken him, and whatever was left was now lost to the house, lost to the madness that had consumed him. I reached the front door. I don't know how I got there. I don't know how my hands found the handle, but they did. I pulled the door open, and the air outside hit me like a slap. The night was cold. The world outside was still, silent. It was the first silence I had heard in days, and I felt it. I breathed it in. I could feel the weight lifting off me. The house behind me was no longer alive. It was just a house. Empty. Hollow. Gone. I turned around. The door was still open. The house behind me was quiet, but I saw something in the window. It was him, or what was left of him. Clayton's face, staring at me through the window. The same cracked smile stretched too far. His eyes were wide, but they weren't his. They were Bonbon's. The puppet's eyes. Hollow. Empty. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I didn't know where to go. But I couldn't go back to that house. Not ever. I walked into the night, away from the house. I left everything behind. Clayton. Bonbon. The house. I didn't look back.